So in my paper in 2019, which comments on Henry Shue's Breakthrough article, I make three fundamental points. So the first one is to assert wholehearted support for the kind of moral anger that is evident throughout all of Henry Shue's work. I think the climate challenge is a fundamentally moral challenge. I think our failures to date to get ahead of the challenge at all, let alone in ways that deliver justice to the world's most vulnerable people, I think that's a moral outrage and a cause for intergenerational shame. And I think Henry's work on climate change and climate ethics just burns with a kind of luminous moral perspective, which I think is really fundamental and important for us not to lose in thinking about the politics of climate change. Which takes me to my second point. So one of the things I do in that 2019 paper is to counsel against the laws of environmental pragmatism. So there is a view about doing climate politics, which is this, that if we want outcomes which are just and meet moral standards, then we ought not to make real world climate negotiations about policy moves and agreements focused on the moral principles that we think really ought to underpin effective and just climate agreements. Why should we not do that if we really care about climate justice? The reason we shouldn't do that, the line of argument goes, is that really sort of raises the stakes in climate negotiations and climate politics in a way that actually makes it less likely that we will end up with outcomes which satisfy those ethical principles and those requirements of justice. So that the kind of driving force behind environmental pragmatism is this thought that if you care about climate justice, don't make it all about climate justice at, for example, the COPs. And I think we need to be extremely careful with that kind of approach to thinking about how to do climate politics. There's a real risk that by sort of backgrounding and masking the ways in which any proposals we make about how to get ahead of the climate crisis serve the ends of climate justice, there's a real risk that we could just end up losing sight of those ideals altogether, right? That we can kind of lose our moral anchor in policy making by kind of hiding what the moral stakes are with a pragmatist approach. And I think that's a real danger. I think it's partly dangerous because it's such a seductive approach for people who genuinely really do care about climate justice and have the appetite to get involved in climate policy making. We need those kinds of people. We really need those kinds of people, but we need them not to be environmental pragmatists. And looking outwards outside of the kind of policy the negotiators and policymakers sort of universe, I think there's a real danger as well, and this is the third point that I make in the paper. I think there's a real danger that if we kind of background mask, hide our fundamental commitments to climate justice and doing climate politics, that we can kind of, the result of that could be an unintended sort of enervation, a sort of demotivation of the will of people on the ground who are in fact committed to climate justice and committed to acting in a way to bring it about. So in the paper, I talk about this idea that climate policy ought to be what I call ethically readable. And what I mean by that is it ought to be possible for those who are affected by those policies to recognize the ways in which the policies promote ends which deliver on climate justice, right? If policies are not, and action generally, and climate politics generally, is not ethically readable in that way, there is a real risk of kind of wasting the political will and the kind of the willingness that people have to mobilise to enact climate justice, because people don't see those ideals of climate justice and ethics as being embodied in the direction of travel for climate policy, even if the environmental pragmatists can assure themselves that actually really the direction of travel is towards just outcomes. So I think we really have to, and I think Henry's work is absolutely fundamental in doing this. Some of the key arguments that he makes and ways of framing the climate problem. So in this case, with respect to the types of emissions that people are creating, I think that can really inform and gives us a sort of language for policy making that keeps it ethically readable and avoids the dangers of environmental pragmatism.